I escaped with my life, for the simple and dreadful reason that 3 Perytons, and not 4 or more, swooped down on us that day. And of all the visions that haunt me of that terrible day, the worst was the sight of that vicious 3rd beast tearing my brother's heart out of his still living body.
Hi everyone, it's your local Game Master Jimmy here. Welcome to the lore video of the Peryton, hybrid amalgamation of eagles and fang-toothed stags. These creatures are in constant pursuit of one thing only, your beating heart. Today I'm going to go over the lore of the Peryton and how it evolved and developed in Dungeons & Dragons, from its inspiration and its origin roots in George Louis Borges' Book of Imaginary Beings to its first actual appearance in 1977 first edition Monster Manual, ultimately culminating with a look at the Peryton in the most recent version of D&D and looking at how it developed and changed. In any case, I want to guarantee there will be at least one detail you haven't heard of yet as we explore the lore of the Peryton in Dungeons & Dragons. Those of you familiar with this game, I primarily draw my sources from the Forgotten Realms, which builds a more concise form of information, but I will dip into other source material for the sake of clarity and elaboration. With that, let us dive into the first appearance and description of the Peryton, which comes from the 1977 Monster Manual by Gary Gygax. Perytons dwell in rocky hills or mountainous regions. They are omnivorous creatures of the weirdest appearance, likely the results of the same type of experimentation as brought about the owlbear. The upper body and head of the Peryton is blue-black, the creature's horns being jet black, the wing and back feathers are dark green, and the chest of the male Peryton is a light blue to medium blue, and the females being drab to a brown. The creature attacks with sharp horns. Its claws are too weak to use. Each Peryton attacks a single creature, and when it's dead, the Peryton tears out the victim's heart with its teeth. The organ is necessary for the Peryton to reproduce, and the creature immediately flies away in order to do so. Human hearts are the type most sought by Perytons. Normal weapons do not harm these creatures. Perytons lair in caves and high upon cliffs, or in the mountain peaks. They will sometimes take humans and similar creatures alive in order to hold them prisoner until needed as food or reproduction needs. Quite a lengthy description of these in the earlier editions, which is kind of pleasant. From here we could already draw stark differences creatively from the Book of Imaginary Beings, going further as to describe the hearts as a necessity for reproduction. A lot of what Gygax drew for some of the monsters from the Monster Manual was from sources like the Book of Imaginary Beings. These creatures were given some twists and adapted to being more compelling for a fantasy game, which really helped them find their home there. That said, the Peryton was still interesting by some regard, as it was said to hail from Atlantis and be prophesized as the downfall of Rome. But I want to go over this monster throughout all of Dungeons & Dragons, so let's build a description of them from all the other sources I have peered into. The Peryton is a medium monstrosity, a magical creature crossed between a giant eagle and a grim twist on a fang-toothed stag. They were about 7 feet long and 5 feet tall. They had darker feathers of green or gray with a distinctive blue, black, or purple head. What differentiated them from being a big bird was their head, which was roughly in the shape of a deer with jagged teeth. The creature had large, sharpened antlers that were set to impaling creatures it flew at. And while their talons have been known to be delicate for combat, they are honed to a razor's edge and still capable of their own lethality. In some situations, the creature is depicted with hooves instead of claws, some of which can be preference based on how much a writer or artist is choosing to utilize the information provided from the Peryton's original lore in the Book of Imaginary Beings. The magical creature mysteriously had an extremely tough hide capable of withstanding all but magical blows, though their intrigue did not end there. They were reported to smell like humans, but exhumed a sense of dread in any close proximity to them. The most notable and mysterious feature was their shadow. The Peryton shadow would often appear different than its normal appearance. The reason why is quite inconclusive. Sometimes the shadow would resemble that shape of a human, while other cases have seen no shadow at all, and others claim its shadow to mimic the last creature it slew or be based on the gender of the creature. In any case, the Peryton shadow existed mostly in mystery to most creatures, as most sources that discuss the Peryton, at least in the Forgotten Realms, have different claims. What we can conclude about the Peryton as a whole was that it desired its prey more than any other worldly desires. and regardless of what shadow cast down on you from above, you could be certain it was going to go for the kill. Quick pause here though, I know these dire hunters are super aggressive with no remorse, but I can't help but imagine the shadow of like a corn dog above me, and that's how I die because some person fed a Peryton a corn dog and it's just like, well, that's swooping from above. Now that we briefly went over a description of the Peryton, I want to discuss a little bit of the overall temperament of these monsters and then talk about their ecology and the aspects of what could be their society. Peryton weren't like most birds of prey. They were aggressively hostile and sought to be up in the fray. They were intelligent enough to concoct well-laid-out ambush and assault plans amongst their own and execute them with dire precision, hunting their prey by flying close to the ground. They were known for their patience in their efforts, meticulously scouting the perfect target as their prey. In most cases, these were humans, the prey of choice. Peryton showed enough intelligence to understand the common tongue of the land, and while not assured, they did have some limited form of communication through screeching and roaring, none of which unfortunately was intelligible to anyone else. Maybe it was their superior intellect and lack of being able to communicate, but Peryton were rather unhappy in their own existence, and they carried out their goal of extracting hearts from humans and the like for solely the purpose of some form of supernatural ascendance that they believed in. And I know I said solely, but actually this is also needed for the female Peryton to be able to reproduce offspring. In any case, each Peryton was drawn to the ambition of eating the perfect heart, which they believed to exist in humans, but not elves, specifically not elves. The lore made it very clear early on that Peryton do not believe that elves have a perfect or are pure of heart. Now, this does change as time goes on. I just think it's very funny that in the early editions they make that very clear. So their desire for the perfect heart, which they believed must be extracted and eaten fresh, was so great that they would go as far as to kidnap humans and enslave them, allowing them to reproduce only to be eaten later. This specifically was only really done by rather intelligent Peryton with the foresight for such machinations. As per usual, for some of these D&D creatures, we oddly have an exuberant amount of lore regarding the reproduction process of a Peryton. We know that the female Peryton needs a fresh heart in order to reproduce, and this heart is believed to be able to come from a human, as well as dwarves, elves, ogres, and orcs. If you remember back, they probably don't prefer elves, so we know they're probably going to go for the human regardless. And we know that since they're not going to willingly choose this, it's probably human. The Peryton would only be fertile for up to 3/4 of a day. When it did lay a clutch, it would be 1 to 4 dense iron-hard eggs, believed to hold the capability to withstand acid spit upon them. These eggs would incubate with the mated pair for a month as well, as either alternated protecting the egg, before which they would hatch to small young that would require feeding within the first few days of life. Although the parents would attempt to feed the young fresh meat, as in fresh hearts, from captured prey, the Peryton was omnivorous, and if times were tough, the Peryton could subsist off vegetation. Of course, this did not quench the desire of fresh hearts, but it did keep the species from dying out. Peryton children would be taken care of for around a year, after which they would fly off and take their own nests. When we descend into what we could call the society of Peryton, we should probably understand how they came about. This is unfortunately yet another speculated topic. The lore teaches us several such potentials as their origin, one such belief tied to deductive reasoning and another sown in religious speculation, as well as others tying the Peryton to otherworldly planes in connection to their fantasy origins and mythology. Our first logic to the origin notes the factors as Peryton having similar aspects to humans, sharing their scent and shadow, and requiring humanoid hearts to reproduce. The logic aimed to state that the Peryton was likely originally human, potentially cursed or transformed long in the past. But the logic doesn't carry further from there, and the only known claimed deity to connect with Peryton was the Beast Lord of Decanter. And if you remember back in the Goblin video, we briefly mentioned Decanter because we had the Decanter goblins, but no one knows if the Beast Lord actually made the Peryton, only that they have worked with him before. Our alternative concept is the recounting of the ancient tale by a scholar of Verdusk. The tale recounts Peryton having once been an ancient race of Imaskar, known as Kala, who were Bane-worshipping cultists who had justice wrought on them by 5 gods of law, Lathander, Mistra, Torm, Ilmater, and Maliki. Their punishment was stated as follows. You have been swift as an eagle in your flight from justice, so I curse each of you with the body of the eagle.
Fierce as a wolf have you been in your persecution of the innocent. So I curse you with the teeth of a wolf.
Foolish as a stag in rut have you been as you shunned what is true and good. So I curse you all to bear the heed and horns of the stag.
You have tormented and torn heart and soul from your victims. So I curse you with unnatural appetites, so that you may only live and prosper after devouring the hearts of your prey.
While you acted as beasts, your heart contained evil which only humans can know. I curse you to always cast the shadow of the humans you once were, to always remind you of your terrible deeds and the souls that you have lost.
And with the will of these gods, they became the Peryton, although the idea alone is somewhat ironic because the gods would have had to just created a creature that still brings harm onto the people around it. So while it is an interesting story, it is highly speculated. Now, the ecology of the Peryton released in Dragon Magazine 82 contradicts the idea of Peryton being experiments, but rather native to some other plane in which they overcame their chaotic nature to subjugate and destroy all other denizens and began spreading into other worlds. This idea is derived from the reference to the Book of Imaginary Beings, in which the Peryton were said to have threatened and potentially conquested, given the fact that you can't find Atlantis anymore. Dun dun. But of course, if you thought the understanding of their origins would be just those few ideas, unfortunately we would be wrong, because we can also tie the Peryton to the demon lord Pazuzu, who had the ability to summon Perytons. This is not necessarily a strong tie into an origin, just an innate ability, but could be something to consider. In Darkwell, Book 2 of the Moonshade Trilogy, we are introduced to the idea that Baal, our god of murder, the god who corrupted the Moonwell, creating the Darkwell, had used bits of devoured wild animals and created children of Baal with these wild animals' parts. And of course, some of these children were Peryton, because they were created from stags and eagles. Of course, you kind of mash that together, you get a Peryton, so he kind of had the ability to do that. Kind of interesting. So I can't say for certain if the gods truly had a large impact on the creature's true origin, or they just worked out conceptually how to make these creatures. Because this was also an ability by the Beast Lord Malar, like we mentioned, in Faiths and Avatars. Dragon Magazine 266 explores an alternative origin of the Perytons as the undead spirits of human travelers, murdered far from home. They first hunt down their killers, and then they prey upon other travelers. This sort of Peryton can only be appeased if its original body is returned to rest in the homeland. And a completely different backstory with Perytons is that they are said to be elves transformed by a hideous curse. This, in a nutshell, is relating to the Palean Peryton, which I would best tie to the Peryton in Eberron lore. And in order to do it justice, I will recommend looking into this one personally if you're that interested in the Eberron lore. And Keith Baker on the internet has a very awesome article which kind of goes over Peryton lore. Very niche category here, but I think that's a great reference for it. So now that we know it is rather hard to pin down exactly where they originated, it would come as little of a surprise to know that they're vastly found all across Faerun and throughout other worlds as well. Some examples where they appear are the Spine of the World, the Nether Mountains, the Walls of Halrua, the Lonely Moor, the Goblin Marches, the Stonelands, the Galena Mountains, the Mountains of Termish. In other campaign settings, Peryton can be found in Cerelia in Birthright, Athos and Darksun, Glantry and Mystara, the Dawnforge Mountains and Cairngorm Peaks in Narath. They do appear in other settings like Eberron, Planescape, Ravenloft, but they're sporadic is the best way to put it in their occurrences, or like on roll for wild monster tables. While these regions largely sound like cliffs of mountains regions as well, the Peryton was well known to dwell within caves actually as well. Of course, given the nature, it would likely seem that the Peryton were isolated hunters that worked alone, and that's partially true. While they were rather chaotic in nature, they did understand that they could take down stronger creatures when they hunted in groups. Of course, this concept alone led to them actually fighting over prey, because there's no such thing as sharing the perfect heart, and in most cases this also meant that they nested rather distant from one another. While they would nest in groups of around 2 to 8 Peryton, those nests would be many miles apart and far away from any other birds of prey as to not compete for food sources. Because their primary goal was to extract and consume the perfect heart, much of their mentality and focus was on perfecting their combat prowess for an extraction. While many creatures had favored weaponry to attack, the Peryton was similar in a way to a monk. Not in the way that they'd channel ki, but the ability to attack with anything possible. The Peryton would swoop down at prey and would lead with its sharpened horn, slashing down from above, clawing with its talons, and snapping quickly center mass with its razor-sharp jaw, just a 3-way attack. So the Peryton formulated a ruthless technique of unrelenting flyby assaults, and since they had focused so much of their effort on achieving victory in combat just for their sheer existence, they even developed techniques to hop around on the ground or slightly off the ground in combat to really throw their foes off their game. But the moment when a creature dropped to the ground unconscious, a ferocity would take over them, and with reckless abandon, they would beeline to ripping out the heart of whatever creature dropped. While we see the direction of the Peryton was largely self-motivated for preservation and its own success, they are in many cases involved in the nefarious dealings of other chaotic creatures. While I don't normally provide a lot of sources as modules in which you will see certain monsters, I think it could be important here because it helps us understand how they do often appear in lore and in modules, but the Peryton doesn't often get treated as a creature that is the forefront problem of a story. They're the monster on the journey you defeat before arriving to the great villain, or even accompany the villain as a companion. If you couldn't guess by now, I think every monster should have its chance at the limelight, at being a big villain, and the Peryton probably isn't the best example of one receiving such credit. Some such examples where we at least get to see the Peryton are Q1, Queen of the Demon Web Pits, C4, To Find a King, and UK2, The Sentinel, and The Wild Beyond the Witchlight's another good example, and Ghosts of Saltmarsh, I think also mentions them as well. I tried to pick examples where you get more unique encounters for the Peryton, but there are plenty actually out there that they appear. Of course, given their nature, these monsters often work rather well with some creatures and not so much with others. This is a rather interesting aspect of them as a whole because their relationships are pretty dynamic and not assured because they're smart creatures capable of rather decent reasoning. So when we talk about the relationships of how Peryton feel about other creatures, we kind of get to a transition point where I want to just look at how some of their opinions of other creatures are. If there's one thing I want you to take away in this video as a Peryton enthusiast and someone who enjoys these creatures and their opinions, it's that Peryton believe that this one creature absolutely sucks. Peryton do not like griffins. If the Peryton is the rogue of a D&D party, the griffin was a lawful good paladin with a police baton. Griffins and Peryton often competed for nesting ground, and while the Peryton was often immune to many forms of physical attacks, not of the magical kind, Griffins just had the power to just call bullshit and just hurt them anyways. There wasn't much of a reason either as to why or how Griffins could hurt Peryton, and maybe it is just a lapse in some old rules clarification, but they were bigger and stronger than Peryton, and they often both served as opposing sides of good and evil, making them rather common oppositions. In the wild, the Griffin was just bigger and could overpower the Peryton, meaning they served as a predator to our heart-munching friends. Apart from Griffins, Peryton had several other less than savory relationships, but a large portion of these were with that of humanoids. At one point throughout history, Peryton decided they do like to eat elf hearts, even if they aren't as pure as humans. So that just expands the window of species that they'd hunt and that can hate them. Other such bad relationships extended to winged folks from Dragon Magazine 51, who are said to assist others in fighting Peryton. The Monster Vault threats to Nintir Vale includes a note on the Mooncalves being at odds with the Peryton, and 5th edition Monster Manual showed us that the Peryton also compete for territory with chimeras and manticores, so they kind of have quite a spread of creatures discontent with them. But to every one of Timora's coins, there is another side. Peryton do develop relationships with creatures in some regard. They are known to work as hunting beasts for cloud giants, minions of green dragons, and in some occasion they have been known to work in combats with harpies and manticore as well. And by proxy, they have been tolerable by the Hundar, or Hindar, however you want to say it. It's actually one or the other and was retconned, I think, from Hundar to Hindar. Another such relationship I mentioned before regarded the Zhentarim Skyriders. These were members of Zenthal Keep that would tame larger creatures to be mounts for their nefarious deeds. I go over a lot of the Zhents in the Wyvern video, so check that out if you want to know more. I think an important distinction between Wyverns being mounts and Peryton being mounts is that Peryton were less likely at odds with their Zhent riders. The Zhentarim was a rather cruelly structured society, and were often admittable to allowing their Peryton to feed on the heart of fresh kills, and probably encourage such processes if they were involved in the reproduction process. As you can see, when we don't have a full concise lore, some of the deductions I can make are somewhat speculative. I think with Peryton specifically, the obscurity of their lore does present a lot of options for including them where you need to and having unique story beats for them. And altogether, if this video has presented less structure than my previous lore videos, it's largely because there was so much information on these monsters, surprisingly, and I did love that. It definitely made it hard to structure though. Of course, I do usually go over the creatures' relationships with other deities and demons, etc., but we've somewhat covered that throughout their origins. And we know they have some form of relationship with the Beast Lord Malar. They have been tied to Loth in the Demon Web Pits, as well as Pazuzu and Baal, but the extent of these relationships could only be surface. And while they are intelligent creatures, their self-motivation and drive from hearts alone seems to overshadow their desire to perform any sacrifice on behalf of gods. Although, since their language is indecipherable, maybe they are and we just don't know. So what are the variant forms of Peryton? Alright, different editions introduce different tiers of monsters, like stronger forms of creatures, which would be considered variants, but by all purposes, there is nothing really different about them. And in the case of the Peryton, a variant would be how loosely you want to define what a variant is. Because the Peryton is largely a combination of two different creatures, an eagle and a stag, we get to the problem area of a variant could be two of any other creatures mixed up, and I don't want to do a misjustice to our bird friend and dare compare them to a griffin, so largely we can consider the monster rather unique in its own regard, and not having too much exactly like it, which I think is why people often find this creature rather interesting. One thing I have noticed when covering several older monsters is when a lot of the lore was being explored in the 80s and 90s with ecology articles in dragon magazines and handbooks over specific classes, we see a lot of information on the worth of a monster's parts. I think people have always enjoyed the idea of selling the parts of monsters they kill or using them for finances or whatever, especially when coin can be tight. So we learn over the course of several articles and books the worth of some of the Peryton's parts, and over the course of the lifespan of D&D, these prices have actually changed and experienced fluctuation and defluctuation based on what a writer decided it was worth. So their horns can sell for around 15 to 25 gold pieces depending on your timeline, and their eggs of offspring can fetch close to 200 gold, but over time devalue to half the price and sometimes lower. But ultimately, while the price has fluctuated, it was rumored that certain aspects of the Peryton could be used for different concoctions with potion craft or magic, which really served to drive its worth up. Alright, we've made it to the point of the video where I go over the newest edition, 2024 5e D&D, and do some comparison and see what we glean in this new edition, so let's begin with that description. Perytons are monstrous predators that hunt people, particularly humans and elves, in favor of all other prey. With the bodies of mighty avian scavengers and fanged stag-like heads, Perytons use ambush tactics to dive bomb travelers. Strangely, the shadows they cast resemble humanoid silhouettes. This supernatural oddity lends credence to the stories that Perytons are cursed humans or elves, or that they arise from carrion birds that feed on the corpses of villains. Perytons tear out the hearts of those they slay, carrying the organs back to their grisly lairs. This gives rise to numerous superstitions surrounding Perytons. Roll on or choose a result from the Peryton superstitions table to inspire why a Peryton steals hearts. Number 1. The heart grants an evil wish. Number 2. It reverts to its original form. Number 3. A new Peryton hatches from each heart. Number 4. A portal opens to the lower planes. So before I get too far into talking about this discussion, I want to take a look at the art real quick. The piece is set in some form of ancient ruins, a little obscure if they are above or below ground, but we see an adventurer who is looking at a mural, actually of the ritual of a Peryton swooping down and stealing hearts. And ironically, they seem to be ambushed by a Peryton in a very quick, similar manner. I enjoyed the torchlight casts the shadow of the humanoid figure pouncing towards the adventurer. I think is a funny, clever inclusion. The Peryton definitely looks menacing with its full-formed attack with razor teeth, talons, and horns. I think this is a very accurate depiction, especially given the isolated adventurer without any help nearby. I think the depiction introduced in this edition is very open-ended and fun. It definitely makes you curious about the obscurity of these creatures. I'll note that it is rather obscure to include the Peryton carry heartbacks to their lairs. That was a rather niche fact they would perform if trying to feed their young. They have historically ravaged on the hearts mid-combat, so that is a different take. The inclusion of the eerie note on their shadow is fun. I find it much better to not know why these shadows are cast by the Peryton because it allows me as a dungeon master to come up with a new unique way, and I have so much inspiration to draw upon from the history of all of their lore. A fun addition was the superstition table. It hosts a callback to older versions and references of the Peryton, and provides some new potential ideas for the fixations on hearts. Previously, we know Peryton needed to eat the heart in order to lay fertile eggs, but one such option here insinuates they could actually hatch from the hearts, which is kind of wild in itself, kind of a fun idea. One feature implemented into the newest edition that I was very happy to see was the Peryton's coup de grace mechanic. Historically, if a Peryton downed a creature, it instantly would consume the heart, and that mechanic has been spotty throughout the editions, but has made its way back. So when the Peryton knocks a creature to 0 health with its talons, it instantly kills the adventurer. And while I know as a player that is terrifying and can be not fun, I think it is well deserved for a terrifying predator that is only a CR2 in this edition. So in the end, we ask ourselves, what is the Peryton? Every direction grasp at to understand where these creatures come from and what more they seek will leave us wanting. But the Peryton is unrelenting. It has shown time and time again it cares not if we understand it, only that we carry on our existence so that it has more of what it wants. Hearts. Obligatory Kingdom Hearts reference. Alright, thank you all for listening to the lore of Peryton. I tried to include a lot of info of these spooky monstrosities, but there's a lot. If I missed something you want to let people know about the Peryton, let me know in the comments, and I'll pin the comment. I'm the local game master, and I want to give a big shout out to Grace, who once again helped me out with some of the audio, doing the voice for some of these deities for me. Go ahead and give her a thanks, and check out her link, which I will include in the description as well. Alright guys, see you in the next one.